The massive crystalline chamber of the Galactic Council buzzed with alien voices, each species represented by their most distinguished diplomats. Ambassador Zexthul of the Korthani Empire adjusted his ceremonial robes, the fabric shimmering with bioluminescent patterns that indicated his high rank. Around him, representatives from 47 different worlds watched, as the human delegation was escorted into the center of the hall. The humans looked so small compared to the towering Vorthak representatives or the multi-limbed Selenites, but it was their audacity that had brought them here today. The girl walking at the front of the human group couldn't have been more than 20 Earth years old, her brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail, wearing nothing more elaborate than a blue jumpsuit with the emblem of the Terran Federation. "State your designation," commanded Council Prime Yultanor, his voice booming through the chamber's acoustic amplifiers. The massive Gorvanian's 4 eyes focused on the young woman who stepped forward without hesitation. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen, representing the Terran Federation's diplomatic corps," she replied, her voice clear and steady despite the overwhelming presence of beings that could crush her without effort. A ripple of what could only be described as amusement passed through the assembled representatives. The Korthani had been dealing with humans for barely 3 galactic cycles, and already these newcomers thought they could demand audience with the Council. It was almost endearing in its naivety. "You have been summoned to answer for the crimes of your species," Yulthanor continued, his massive frame casting shadows across the chamber floor. "The unauthorized colonization of the Kepler 442 system, the disruption of established trade routes, and most grievously, the complete disregard for the galactic accords that have maintained peace for over 2,000 cycles." Sarah's expression remained calm, though her hands clenched slightly at her sides. "With respect, Council Prime, humanity was never made aware of these accords. We received no communication, no warning, no attempt at contact until your enforcement fleets arrived in our space." The chamber erupted in a cacophony of alien languages. Translator devices struggled to keep up with the outrage being expressed in dozens of different tongues. How dare this primitive species suggest that the Council had failed in its duties? Zexthul leaned forward in his seat, studying the human girl with newfound interest. There was something about her demeanor that seemed unusual. Most species, when brought before the Council for judgment, displayed obvious signs of fear or submission. The humans appeared neither cowed nor aggressive, but rather expectant. "Ignorance of the law is not a defense," declared Councillor Vexmira of the Hegemony, her chitinous exoskeleton clicking with agitation. "Your species has violated sacred boundaries, disrupted the natural order, and shown complete contempt for civilized space. Furthermore," added another voice from the upper galleries, "your military forces destroyed 3 enforcement vessels when ordered to withdraw from contested space. This alone constitutes an act of war against the Galactic Council." Sarah's composure finally cracked just slightly. "Those enforcement vessels opened fire on civilian transport ships carrying families to new colonies. We defended innocent people. Colonies that should never have existed." Yulthanor's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. "The Kepler 442 system has been designated as a preserve for the Threnody migration routes for over 600 cycles. Your presence there threatens an entire species' reproductive cycle." The young human woman straightened her shoulders. "Then why wasn't this information shared with us? We've been trying to establish diplomatic contact for decades. Every message we sent into space went unanswered. We followed every first contact protocol we could imagine." A new voice spoke from the shadows of the upper council chambers, one that made several of the representatives visibly flinch. It belonged to Keeper Morden of the Eternal Archive, a being so ancient that some questioned whether he was still truly alive, or merely an echo of consciousness preserved in crystalline form. "The protocols you speak of assume a certain level of evolutionary achievement." Morden's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Your species has existed for what, 200,000 of your years? The youngest member of this council represents a civilization that achieved faster than light travel when your ancestors were still discovering fire." The chamber fell silent. Even among the representatives, few had ever heard Keeper Morden speak during an actual session. His words carried the weight of eons, of civilizations that had risen and fallen before Earth's sun had finished forming. "Your species exhibits patterns we have seen before," he continued. "Rapid expansion, aggressive territorial behavior, refusal to acknowledge established authority. It always ends the same way. Sarah took a step forward, and surprisingly, none of the guards moved to stop her. And how does it end, Keeper? With correction, Mordoun replied simply. With the restoration of order. Yulthanor rose from his seat, his massive frame blocking out the soft light that filtered down from the chamber's apex. Lieutenant Sarah Chen of the Terran Federation, you and your species have been found guilty of violations against the Galactic Accords. The sentence is immediate dissolution of all human colonies beyond your home system, followed by a quarantine period of no less than 5,000 cycles. The words hit the human delegation like physical blows. Several of the other representatives gasped, their translator devices struggling with emotional context. 5,000 cycles would effectively end human civilization as they knew it. However, Yulthanor continued, the Council recognizes that your species may simply require guidance, a demonstration of the consequences of defying established order. Therefore, as is traditional in such cases, a representative of your species will be executed as an example to your people. This will serve both as punishment for past crimes and warning against future transgressions. Sarah's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. I volunteer. The chamber erupted again, this time in genuine surprise. Even Zexthal found himself leaning forward, his bioluminescent patterns shifting to express confusion. In all his cycles of service, he had never seen a diplomatic representative volunteer for execution. It is decided, Yulthanor declared, raising a massive hand to silence the assembly. Tomorrow at the rise of the third sun, Lieutenant Sarah Chen will be executed by the traditional method. Her death will serve as a message to all humanity. The Galactic Council's authority is absolute. As the session concluded and the human delegation was escorted away, Zexthal couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just shifted in the galaxy. The girl's expression as she was led away wasn't one of defeat or terror, but rather of grim satisfaction, as if everything was proceeding according to some plan he couldn't fathom. In the depths of the Council's detention levels, something ancient stirred in response to the scent of approaching change. The execution plaza stretched across nearly a square kilometer of polished obsidian, its surface reflecting the light of 3 suns that hung in the alien sky above the Council's capital world. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy had gathered to witness what many considered a historic moment, the first execution of a human by Galactic Council decree. Ambassador. Zexthal stood among the diplomatic observers, his ceremonial robes now bearing the deep crimson patterns that indicated his role as official witness. Despite his many cycles of service, he found himself unusually troubled by the proceedings. The human girl had spent her final night in meditation, rather than pleading for mercy or trying to contact her homeworld. It was behavior that defied every psychological profile the Council had developed for her species. High above the plaza, on a crystalline platform that seemed to float without visible support, Council Prime Yulthanor raised the blade of final judgment. The ancient weapon hummed with contained energy, its edge capable of severing molecular bonds. It had ended the lives of criminals and revolutionaries from 100 different worlds. But this would be its first taste of human blood. Sarah Chen knelt on the execution stone, her hands bound behind her back with quantum restraints that made escape impossible. Her head was held in place by the traditional wooden block, a piece of timber from a tree that had grown on the Council's homeworld for over 3,000 cycles. The symbolism was intentional, the old, established order literally supporting the death of the new and chaotic. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Yulthanor's voice boomed across the plaza, amplified by both technology and the natural acoustics of the space. Do you have final words before judgment is carried out? Sarah lifted her head as much as the restraints allowed, her eyes scanning the assembled crowd before settling on something in the distance that made her smile. It was not the expression anyone expected from someone about to die. I have a message for my people, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the morning air. Remember the words of our ancestors. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all sentient beings are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Several of the alien diplomats shifted uncomfortably. The translator devices were struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in most galactic languages. The idea that rights could be unalienable or self-evident was foreign to societies that had been built on strict hierarchies for millennia. And my second message, Sarah continued, her smile growing broader, is for the council itself. You should have done your research. Before anyone could ask what she meant, the blade of final judgment descended in a perfect arc. The energy field surrounding its edge separated Sarah's head from her shoulders with surgical precision, cauterizing the wound instantly. Her head rolled once before coming to rest facing the crowd, eyes still open, that strange smile still playing on her lips. For a moment, absolute silence reigned in the plaza. Then, as tradition demanded, the assembled representatives began the ritual chant of justice fulfilled. The ceremony would continue for another hour, with speeches about the importance of order and the consequences of defying established authority. But something was wrong. Ambassador Zexthul felt it first, a vibration in the obsidian beneath his feet that seemed to come from deep within the planet itself. The other diplomats noticed it moments later as the ritual chant faltered and died. Even Council Prime Yulthanor paused, lowering the still humming blade as he searched for the source of the disturbance. The vibration grew stronger, accompanied by a sound that made every being in the plaza freeze in terror. It was a roar, but not just any roar. This was the call of something so ancient and powerful that it existed in the genetic memory of every species represented in the crowd. It was the sound of apex predation, of death incarnate, of something that had been sleeping in the depths for so long that most had forgotten it existed. From the detention levels far below the plaza came the sound of metal being torn apart like paper. Emergency alarms began wailing across the capital city, as seismic sensors registered something massive moving through the subterranean levels of the council complex. Security forces scrambled to respond, but their reports made no sense. Massive claw marks in walls made of materials that should have been impervious to physical damage, corridors filled with superheated air that suggested the presence of something capable of breathing fire. "What is happening?" demanded Councillor Vexmira, her exoskeleton rattling with fear. "What have the humans done?" The answer came from the most unexpected source. From her position on the execution block, Sarah Chen's severed head spoke, her voice somehow carrying clearly across the plaza, despite the impossibility of the situation. "You keep a dragon in your basement," she said, her dead eyes somehow still holding that infuriating smile. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" The revelation hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. The dragon, the last of the ancient Pyrothane race, the being that had been captured and imprisoned by the Council over 1,000 cycles ago as a demonstration of their power. Most of the current representatives hadn't even known it still existed, the knowledge restricted to only the highest levels of the Council hierarchy. "Impossible," Yulthanor breathed. "The containment protocols are absolute. The creature has been in stasis for—" His words were cut off as a section of the plaza's obsidian surface exploded outward in a geyser of molten rock and flame. From the depths rose something that belonged to legends and nightmares, a creature of such immense size and power that it seemed to blot out the three suns overhead. The dragon was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Its scales were the deep red of cooling lava, each one the size of a starship's hull plate. Its eyes burned with an inner fire that had been building for 1,000 cycles of imprisonment. When it spread its wings, the resulting downward wind pressure shattered windows and buildings across the capital city. But most shocking of all was what the dragon carried clutched gently in one massive claw, Sarah Chen's body, held with the care one might use to transport a precious relic. The dragon's gaze swept across the terrified assembly before settling on Council Prime Yulthanor. When it spoke, its voice was like the rumble of tectonic plates, like the death song of dying stars. 1,347 cycles, it said, each word dropping like a hammer blow. "That is how long you have kept me as your trophy, your proof that even the ancient powers bow to your authority." Yulthanor tried to respond, but his voice failed him. The blade of final judgment, which had seemed so mighty moments before, now appeared pathetically small in his trembling hands. "But this one," the dragon continued, lifting Sarah's body higher, "this one was different. When they brought her to the detention level, she did not cower or plead. She walked to the edge of my prison and spoke to me not as a prisoner to a prisoner, but as one sapient being to another. The dragon's eyes blazed brighter, and several of the nearer spectators felt their clothing begin to smolder. She told me about her species, about their wars and their art, their love and their losses. She told me about a concept her people call freedom, not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of choice. And she made me understand something I had forgotten during my long imprisonment. The great head turned toward Sarah's severed head, still resting on the execution block. She reminded me that I had never chosen to bow to your authority. You merely took advantage of my hibernation cycle to bind me while I slept. But choice, true choice, can never be taken, only deferred. With careful precision, the dragon began to reunite Sarah's head with her body, holding both pieces together as its inner fire began to build to levels that made the air itself shimmer with heat. And now, the dragon's voice carried a note of something that might have been joy. I choose. The dragon's internal fire erupted like a miniature star, washing over Sarah's body with temperatures that should have reduced any organic matter to its component atoms. Instead, something impossible happened. The energy seemed to flow into her severed form, reconnecting tissue, restoring function, rebuilding what had been destroyed. The quantum restraints that had bound her hand simply evaporated under the assault of forces that operated on principles the Council's science couldn't, explained Ambassador Zexthal, watched in horrified fascination as Sarah Chen's eyes fluttered open. Her hand moved to her neck, finding only smooth skin where moments before there had been a wound that had separated her head from her body. She sat up slowly, testing her movements with the careful precision of someone relearning how to exist. Thank you, old friend, she said to the dragon, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed impossible given the circumstances, though I suspect this isn't exactly what either of us planned. The great creature's laugh was like the sound of continents shifting. Plans are for those who lack the power to adapt, young human. Your species understands this better than most. Council Prime Yulthanor finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. This is impossible. The dead cannot be restored. The fundamental laws of physics were written by beings far younger than I, the dragon interrupted, its attention turning back to the terrified assembly. Your council believes it understands the universe because you have mapped the movements of stars and cataloged the properties of matter. But you have never learned the most important truth of existence. Sarah stood, brushing obsidian dust from her jumpsuit with movements that seemed perfectly normal despite her recent resurrection. That consciousness is the fundamental force, she said, completing the dragon's thought. Not matter, not energy, but will itself. The determination to continue existing regardless of what the universe throws at you. Precisely, the dragon rumbled with approval. Your species grasps this instinctively. When faced with extinction, you do not submit, you evolve. When confronted with impossible odds, you do not surrender, you adapt. When told you cannot do something, you prove that cannot is merely another word for haven't figured out how yet. The assembled representatives were backing away now, their diplomatic protocols useless in the face of forces that challenged their understanding of reality itself. Security forces had arrived at the edges of the plaza, but their weapons seemed pitifully inadequate against a creature that had just casually violated the most basic laws of life and death. The Terran Federation has been monitoring council space for over 50 years, Sarah explained, her tone conversational despite the chaos around them. We've been listening to your communications, studying your technology, learning about your member species. We knew about the dragon before we ever sent our first colony ship. Counselor Vexmira's exoskeleton was clicking so rapidly it sounded like static. You planned this? This entire confrontation was orchestrated? Not planned, Sarah corrected. Hoped for. We've been trying to establish peaceful contact for decades, but every attempt was ignored. So we decided to make contact impossible to ignore. We established colonies and systems we knew would provoke a response, defended them just enough to prove we were serious, and waited for you to do exactly what you always do when faced with someone who won't acknowledge your authority. You deliberately sacrificed your colonies? Yulthanor's voice carried a mix of horror and grudging respect. Billions of your people were volunteers, Sarah said firmly. Every single person who signed up for the Kepler missions knew this was a possibility. They went anyway because that's what humans do when something important is at stake. We risk everything for the chance to make things better. The dragon lowered its great head until it was level with the diplomatic gallery. Several representatives fainted from the proximity to so much barely contained power.
I have watched your council for over a millennium, and I have seen the pattern.
You encounter a species that might challenge your dominance, so you find a reason to destroy or subjugate them. You call it maintaining order, but it is really maintaining fear. The Gorvani were too aggressive, so you eliminated them. The Thessian collective was too innovative, so you absorbed them. The Wanderer fleet was too independent, so you scattered them across the galaxy. Always you find a justification. Always you convince yourselves that you act for the greater good. Ambassador Zex Thul felt his worldview crumbling as he listened. The dragon was reciting the secret history of the Council, events that were classified at the highest levels. How could it know these things? Because I was there, the dragon said, apparently reading his thoughts. For every conquest, every subjugation, every genocide disguised as necessity, I was your prisoner watching from the depths. And with each atrocity, my determination to one day see justice done grew stronger. Sarah walked to the edge of the execution platform, looking out over the plaza filled with thousands of beings who had come to watch her die. Humanity isn't here to conquer anyone or destroy anything. We're here to offer you something your council has spent millennia trying to suppress. Choice. The choice to say no, the dragon added. The choice to question authority. The choice to decide for yourselves what kind of future you want to build instead of accepting the one that others build for you. This is sedition, Yulthanor snarled, raising the blade of final judgment again. Rebellion against the natural order. Your species will be eliminated for this. Sarah smiled that same infuriating smile she had worn to her execution. With what fleet? Our primitive ships destroyed your enforcement vessels without breaking a sweat. Our colonies are still expanding faster than you can mount response operations. And now you're facing open rebellion from the most powerful being in your own capital city. More than that, the dragon said, spreading its wings wide enough to cast the entire plaza into shadow. Word of this day will spread to every world in council space. They will learn that the mighty Galactic Council's authority rests on nothing more than the willingness of others to submit, and some of them will choose not to. As if summoned by the dragon's words, new reports began flooding into the council's communication systems. Uprisings on a dozen worlds, colonial governors declaring independence, member species demanding renegotiation of treaties that had been imposed rather than negotiated. The carefully maintained order that had ruled the galaxy for 2 millennia was beginning to crack. This is chaos, Councillor Vexmira protested. Without central authority, there will be war, famine, the collapse of interstellar civilization itself. There will be freedom, Sarah replied simply. And yes, some of them will use that freedom to make mistakes. Some will choose conflict over cooperation. Some will struggle to find their way without someone telling them what to do, but that's their choice to make. The dragon's voice carried across the plaza with finality. The age of imposed order is ending. The age of chosen cooperation is beginning, and humanity will be there to help anyone who wants to learn how to stand on their own. With that, the great creature launched itself into the sky, its powerful wings creating downdrafts that shattered the remaining windows in the council complex. Sarah Chen climbed onto its back with practiced ease, leaving the assembled representatives to contemplate the ruins of everything they thought they knew about how the galaxy worked. As they disappeared into the alien sky, the only sound in the plaza was the quiet clicking of Councillor Vexmira's exoskeleton and the distant wail of emergency sirens as reports of rebellion continued to pour in from across council space. 3 months after the execution that wasn't, the galaxy had become a very different place. Ambassador Zexthul stood in what had once been the grand chamber of the Galactic Council, now serving as a refugee processing center for beings fleeing the chaos that had erupted across dozens of star systems. The crystalline walls that had once echoed with the pronouncements of absolute authority now bore hastily mounted displays showing shipping schedules and medical aid distribution networks. The Korthani Empire, his own people, had been among the first to declare independence from the Council. The irony wasn't lost on him that his species, which had served as enforcers of Council authority for over 500 cycles, had also been among the most eager to throw off that same authority once they realized it was optional. Ambassador Zexthul, the voice belonged to a young Thessian engineer, her chitinous features marked with the traditional scarification that indicated her family had been refugees from the original collective absorption. The human delegation has arrived for the infrastructure meeting. He nodded, adjusting his robes. The bioluminescent patterns now showed the deep blue of the independent Corthani Confederation, rather than the crimson of Council service. It had taken weeks to learn the new protocols, the strange concept of negotiating with equals rather than issuing edicts to subordinates. The conference room that had once hosted only the most senior council officials now buzzed with representatives from nearly 200 independent systems. At the center of it all sat Sarah Chen, very much alive and serving as humanity's chief diplomatic coordinator for what they were calling the transition period. The Serpentis cluster is requesting immediate aid, reported a tall, crystalline being whose species Zexthul didn't recognize. Their food distribution system was entirely dependent on council logistics networks. Without central coordination, they're looking at widespread famine within months. Sarah nodded, making notes on a device that seemed almost primitive compared to council technology. We can reroute 3 grain ships from the Terran agricultural worlds. The Dragon has also identified several uninhabited systems with suitable planets for emergency agricultural development. You speak of the Dragon as if it serves humanity, observed Councillor Vexmira. She was one of the few council members who had remained on the capital world, though her role now was purely advisory. This seemed unlikely. The Dragon serves no one, Sarah replied calmly. That's rather the point. It chooses to help because it wants to, not because it has to, just like everyone else here. Through the tall windows that overlooked the capital city, the great creature could be seen resting on what had once been the Council's military command center. It had taken up residence there shortly after the events in the plaza, and its presence served as a constant reminder to anyone who might be considering a return to the old ways that such attempts would be inadvisable. The independence movements are spreading faster than we can monitor, reported another delegate, this one representing a coalition of mining worlds that had formed their own federation. The hegemony is trying to maintain control through military force, but their fleet commanders are defecting faster than they can be replaced. Any species that wants independence should have it, Sarah said firmly. Our job isn't to replace the Council's authority with our own. Our job is to make sure the transition doesn't result in unnecessary suffering. Zexithul found himself speaking before he had fully formed the thought. Why? When the room turned to look at him, he continued, Forgive me, but I must ask, what does humanity gain from this? Your species has effectively dismantled the most powerful government in galactic history. You could easily establish yourselves as the new dominant power. Instead, you're helping your former enemies achieve independence. Why? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. Because we remember what it was like to be alone in the dark, wondering if there was anyone else out there. We remember sending messages into space for decades without getting any response. We remember the feeling of being the only intelligent species in an empty universe. She gestured toward the window, where ships from dozens of different worlds were coming and going in a carefully coordinated dance of mutual aid. We're not alone anymore. None of us are, and that's worth more than any empire. Besides, added a new voice from the doorway, empires are exhausting to maintain. Everyone turned to see the dragon's massive eye peering through the reinforced window, its pupil larger than most of the beings in the room. When it spoke, its voice resonated through the building structure itself. I have watched species rise and fall for longer than your civilizations have existed. The dragon continued. The ones who try to rule others always burn themselves out fighting to maintain control. The ones who help others stand on their own feet tend to thrive for millennia. A small Thessian delegate raised one of her forearms. But surely there must be some form of coordination. Some way to prevent conflicts between independent systems, to maintain trade agreements, to address disputes. Absolutely, Sarah agreed. But that coordination should come from the bottom up, not the top down. Systems that want to work together should be free to form alliances. Those that prefer isolation should be free to pursue it. The key is that it's their choice. We've drafted a proposal for what we're calling the Galactic Cooperation Network, added another human representative, activating a holographic display that showed a complex web of voluntary associations and mutual aid agreements. No central authority, no imposed regulations, just a framework for species that want to work together to do so effectively. Zexthul studied the display with fascination. It was unlike anything he had seen before. A governmental structure that explicitly limited its own power, that built in safeguards against the accumulation of authority. This is theoretical, surely. No system of governance has ever voluntarily restricted its own growth. That's because most systems of governance are designed by people who want to govern, Sarah replied. This one was designed by people who want to be left alone but recognize that complete isolation isn't practical in a connected galaxy. The humans have a saying. The dragon's voice rumbled through the building. The best leaders are those who have no desire to lead. It is perhaps the wisest thing any species has ever discovered. Over the following hours, they worked through dozens of crisis reports and coordination requests, independent systems learning to manage their own affairs, species discovering they could say no to agreements they didn't like, worlds that had been suppressed for centuries finally free to develop according to their own values and priorities. It wasn't perfect. There were conflicts, misunderstandings, systems that struggled without central support. But there was also something that hadn't existed in the galaxy for over 2 millennia: genuine diversity. Species developing in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. As the meeting concluded and the various delegates prepared to return to their ships, Zexathul found himself walking alongside Sarah toward the landing platforms. "I have one more question," he said as they waited for his transport. "The resurrection. How is it possible that you returned from death?" Sarah smiled, that same expression that had so confused him during her trial. "Who says I died?" Before he could ask what she meant, she was climbing aboard her own ship, leaving him with yet another mystery to contemplate. As his transport lifted off from the former council capital, Zexthul looked down at the city below and realized that for the first time in his long diplomatic career, he was looking forward to an uncertain future. Change, it seemed, was a remarkably addictive force once you got used to it. 2 years had passed since the day that changed everything, and the galaxy bore little resemblance to its former self. Where once there had been the monolithic Galactic Council enforcing uniform law across thousands of systems, now there existed a complex tapestry of alliances, federations, and independent worlds, each developing according to their own unique characteristics and needs. Dr. Elena Vasquez, humanities chief xenobiologist and Sarah Chen's former colleague, stood in the observation deck of the research station Harmony, watching as the dragon performed what could only be described as surgery on a dying star. The massive creature moved through space without any visible life support, its scales glowing cherry red as it channeled unimaginable energies to stabilize the star's fusion. Reactions. Preliminary readings indicate the stellar collapse has been completely reversed, reported her Thessian assistant Dr. Kexthera, her mandibles clicking with excitement. The star should maintain stable fusion for at least another billion years. And the dragon accomplishes this how exactly? Asked Ambassador Zexthul, who had become something of a regular visitor to the human research stations. His people's newfound independence had allowed them to pursue scientific collaboration that had been forbidden under council regulations. Elena shrugged, a gesture that had become common among many species as human body language spread through the galactic community. "We honestly don't know. Our best theories suggest it's manipulating fundamental forces at a quantum level. But the energy requirements should be impossible for any biological entity. Unless," Dr. Kexathera added thoughtfully, "consciousness itself is a fundamental force rather than an emergent property of complex matter arrangements." It was a theory that had gained significant support in the post-council era. The dragon's casual violation of physical laws, Sarah's resurrection, and numerous other phenomena observed around humanity suggested that sentient will could directly influence reality in ways that conventional physics couldn't explain. "Speaking of impossible things," Zexthul said, "have you made any progress in understanding Lieutenant Chen's survival? My people are still struggling to accept that death can be temporary." Elena's expression grew thoughtful. "We've run every test imaginable. Sarah is definitely alive, definitely human, and shows no signs of artificial enhancement or exotic technology, but she also remembers dying. She describes the experience in detail, the sensation of her consciousness separating from her body, the period of existence as pure awareness, and then the dragon's fire somehow calling her back. Could it be that humans have some natural resistance to permanent death?" Dr. Kexathera suggested. "Your species does display unusual persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges." "More likely," came a familiar voice from behind them. It's a matter of refusing to accept that death is necessarily final. They turned to see Sarah Chen herself entering the observation deck, wearing the simple blue jumpsuit that had become something of a uniform among human diplomatic staff. Despite extensive medical examination, she appeared to be exactly the same person who had been executed 2 years earlier, with no signs of aging or artificial enhancement. "Sarah," Elena said warmly, embracing her old friend. "How did the hegemony negotiations go?" "Better than expected," Sarah replied, moving to stand beside the observation window where the dragon was putting the finishing touches on its stellar engineering project. "They're finally ready to admit that military force can't hold their territory together when half their member species have decided they'd rather govern themselves. And the remaining council loyalists?" Zexthol asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Down to 3 systems, all of them heavily dependent on automated infrastructure that's starting to break down without regular maintenance," Sarah said. "They'll come around eventually. Pride can only sustain you for so long when your life support systems are failing." Dr. Kexathara's antennae twitched with curiosity. "I understand your people have made contact with species beyond the former council territories. Is it true that some of them have technologies that make even your capabilities seem primitive?" Sarah's expression grew distant. "The architects showed us structures that exist in 11 dimensions simultaneously. The singers can manipulate gravity by humming in harmonics that shouldn't be possible for organic vocal cords. The Wanderers have ships that travel by folding space-time like origami. Yet none of them ever challenged the Council's authority," Zexthul observed. "Why? Because they didn't need to," Sarah explained. "Advanced civilizations tend to turn inward, focusing on perfecting their own existence rather than expanding their influence. The Council was allowed to exist because it kept the younger, more aggressive species organized and out of their way." Elena frowned. "That seems almost callous. They could have prevented centuries of oppression." "Could they?" Sarah asked. "Think about it from their perspective. Every species needs to learn how to stand up for itself eventually. If someone else always fights your battles for you, you never develop the strength to fight them yourself." Through the observation window, they watched as the dragon completed its work and began flying back toward the station. Its massive form moved with a grace that seemed to mock the laws of physics, banking and turning through space as if it were flying through atmosphere. "Besides," Sarah continued, "intervention from above just creates a different kind of oppression. The architects could have destroyed the council with a thought, but then what? Every species in the galaxy becomes dependent on their protection instead of learning to protect themselves. So humanity's role in all this was to serve as, what, a catalyst?" Dr. Kexthara asked. "More like a mirror," Sarah said. "We showed everyone else that the council's authority was artificial, that it only existed because people believed it existed. Once that belief was broken, the whole system collapsed under its own weight. The dragon had reached the station now, its massive head visible through the reinforced transparasteel of the observation deck. When it spoke, its voice resonated through the station's hull. The young ones learn quickly, it rumbled approvingly. Already I see species developing capabilities they never knew they possessed. The Thessians are creating art that exists in multiple dimensions. The Corthani are discovering mathematical principles that should not be accessible to 3-dimensional minds. The former slaves of the hegemony are building cities that float on quantum uncertainty." "Evolution in action," Elena murmured. "Remove the artificial constraints and life finds ways to grow that no one could have predicted." "Precisely," the dragon agreed. "And humanity serves as proof that intelligence and determination can overcome any obstacle, even death itself." Zexthul turned to study Sarah with renewed interest. "You still haven't explained how you survived execution." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching as ships from dozens of different species moved through the space around the station, carrying supplies, sharing knowledge, building the foundations of something unprecedented in galactic history. "The dragon didn't bring me back to life," she said finally. "I never actually died, but we all saw," Zexthul began. "You saw my body die?" Sarah interrupted. "But consciousness isn't the same thing as physical existence. When humans face something that should destroy us, we have a tendency to adapt. Sometimes that adaptation happens at levels that aren't immediately visible." Dr. Kexthara's mandibles clicked rapidly. You're suggesting that human consciousness can exist independently of physical form? I'm suggesting that the line between possible and impossible is a lot blurrier than most species assume, Sarah replied. And that determination, real determination, can sometimes rewrite the rules entirely. Elena shook her head in amazement. Even after all this time, you're still full of surprises. That's humanity for you, Sarah said with a grin. We specialize in the impossible. Outside the station, the dragon spread its wings and began another graceful turn through space, heading toward a distant system where a young civilization was just beginning to wonder if they were alone in the universe. Soon they would discover they were not alone at all, and that the galaxy was full of possibilities they had never dared to imagine. The age of imposed order was indeed over. The age of infinite potential had begun. 5 years after the execution that changed the galaxy, the former council capital had been transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. Where once rigid governmental buildings had enforced conformity and submission, now sprawled a vast complex dedicated to what humanity called the Great Collaboration, an open forum where any species could share knowledge, request assistance, or simply learn about the incredible diversity of life that flourished throughout the stars. Ambassador Zexthul, now serving as the Korthani representative to the Collaboration Council, walked through gardens where plants from 1,000 different worlds grew in impossible harmony. Thessian crystal flowers that sang in response to emotions grew alongside earth roses, while Gorvanian flame fruits provided gentle warmth to heat-loving species from the outer rim worlds. At the center of it all stood a monument that drew visitors from across the galaxy, a simple obsidian block, polished to mirror brightness, with a single inscription, "In memory of the age when beings believed they had no choice." It's remarkable, isn't it? Sarah Chen's voice came from behind him, still carrying that note of quiet satisfaction that had puzzled him for so many years. Zexthul turned to greet her, noting that she appeared exactly as she had on the day of her execution. While other beings aged and changed, Sarah seemed frozen at the moment of her resurrection, as if death had somehow made her immune to the passage of time. "What's remarkable is that it works at all," he replied, gesturing toward the bustling plaza, where representatives from hundreds of species were engaged in animated discussions. No central authority, no enforcement mechanisms, no punishment for those who choose not to participate. By all conventional wisdom, this should have collapsed into chaos within months. Conventional wisdom assumed that beings needed to be controlled, Sarah said, leading him toward a quiet alcove where they could observe without being overheard. It never occurred to the council that most species actually want to cooperate. They just want to do it on their own terms. Through the transparasteel walls, they could see the dragon engaged in what appeared to be a philosophical discussion with a group of architect philosophers, the ancient creature's massive head nodding thoughtfully as crystalline beings shared concepts that existed in dimensions beyond normal perception. "The dragon has become quite the teacher," Zexthul observed. "My youngest offspring attended one of its lectures on the nature of imposed reality. She came home with ideas that challenged everything we thought we knew about physics." "Good," Sarah said firmly. "That's exactly what we hoped would happen. Every species brings something unique to the galactic community. The dragon brings perspective, the understanding that what seems impossible is often just unfamiliar." A soft chime indicated that the day's General Assembly was about to begin. Unlike the rigid ceremonies of the old council, these gatherings were informal affairs where anyone could present ideas, request assistance, or share discoveries. Today's agenda included a proposal from the Wanderer fleet to establish mobile universities, a report on the successful terraforming of 3 formerly uninhabitable worlds, and a presentation by human scientists on their latest findings about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. "Before we go in," Zexthul said, "I have to ask. The mystery of your survival has become something of a legend throughout the galaxy. Some species have even begun developing religions around the concept of consciousness, triumphing over physical death. Don't you think it's time to provide a complete explanation?" Sarah smiled, that same enigmatic expression that had confused diplomats and scientists for years. "The complete explanation wouldn't help anyone. What matters isn't how it happened, but what it represents. Which is proof that the universe is far stranger and more wonderful than anyone imagined," she said simply. Proof that consciousness, determination, and the refusal to accept defeat can accomplish things that seem to violate every natural law. Proof that every species has capabilities they haven't even begun to explore. They entered the assembly hall, where representatives from over 300 different worlds had gathered. The diversity was staggering. Beings of pure energy sitting alongside silicon-based crystalline entities. Aquatic species in portable ocean environments sharing space with gas giant dwellers, whose bodies were composed of organized atmospheric phenomena. The session began with a report from the Outreach Fleet, humanity's ongoing mission to make contact with species beyond the former Council territories. Captain Maria Santos, Sarah's former military colleague, appeared via hologram from the bridge of the exploration vessel New Horizons. "We've made contact with 17 previously unknown civilizations in the past year," she reported. "Most were suspicious initially, having learned to hide from what they assumed was an expansionist galactic empire. Once they understood that we were offering cooperation rather than conquest, their response has been universally positive." "Any signs of hostile civilizations?" asked a representative from one of the rim worlds. "None so far," Captain Santos replied. "We've encountered species that prefer isolation, others that are too advanced to be interested in contact with younger civilizations, and several that are still in early stages of development. But no one who seems intent on conquest or destruction." Dr. Kexthera, now serving as the collaboration's chief xenobiologist, stood to present her latest findings. "Our research suggests that aggressive expansionist civilizations are actually quite rare in the galaxy. Most species that develop faster than light travel also develop the wisdom to understand that cooperation produces better results than conquest." "Then why did the Council become so authoritarian?" asked a young Gorvanian delegate. "Fear," Sarah said simply, rising from her seat. "Fear that without strict control everything would fall apart. Fear that diversity meant chaos. Fear that allowing others to make their own choices would somehow diminish their own power. But here we are," added the dragon's voice, resonating through the assembly hall's acoustic systems. 5 years later, and the galaxy is more peaceful, more prosperous, and more innovative than it has been in millennia." The statistics supported the claim. Trade between independent systems had increased by 400%. Technological innovation was proceeding at unprecedented rates as species shared knowledge freely, rather than hoarding it behind bureaucratic barriers. Population growth had stabilized as worlds found sustainable development models that worked for their specific environmental conditions. Most importantly, Sarah continued, "Every species is free to develop according to its own nature. The singers are creating music that reshapes matter at the molecular level. The dreamers are building civilizations that exist partially in alternate dimensional spaces. The gardeners are transforming dead worlds into living ecosystems using techniques that seem like magic to everyone else." "And humanity?" asked Zexthul. "What is your species becoming?" Sarah looked around the assembly hall, taking in the incredible diversity of life that had gathered to work together rather than dominate each other. "We're becoming what we always were," she said. "Explorers, problem solvers, bridge builders. We're becoming the species that helps others become the best versions of themselves." The dragon's massive eye appeared at one of the hall's reinforced windows, its ancient gaze sweeping across the assembled representatives. The Council believed that order required uniformity. Humanity has proven that true order emerges from diversity working in harmony. It is perhaps the most important lesson any species has taught in the last 1,000,000 years. As the session continued, with species after species sharing discoveries, requesting assistance, and offering their own unique contributions to the galactic community, Zexthul found himself marveling at how simple it had all turned out to be. Remove the artificial barriers, stop trying to force everyone into the same mold, and life found ways to flourish that no central authority could ever have planned or predicted. The girl who had walked calmly to her execution had been right. The universe was indeed far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had imagined. And now, finally, everyone was free to explore just how strange and wonderful it could become. In the depths of space, the New Horizons and dozens of other exploration vessels continued their missions, carrying a simple message to any civilization they encountered: "You are not alone. You are welcome." And the galaxy is big enough for everyone to find their own path among the stars. The age of imposed order was dead. The age of infinite possibility had only just begun,